The time now is 24 minutes past 12.
Steve Yabsley.
BBC Radio Bristol.
And time to meet my next guest of the day. Delighted to say I'm joined by the author and so much more, Campbell McPherson. Welcome to the programme, Campbell.
Thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
Not at all. Now, Campbell has written a book called You Part 2, Thriving in the Second Half of Your Life, described as the must-read guide to thriving, not retiring, in the second half of your life for anyone who is 50 years young. And we should also mention it's co-written with his wife Jane, who is from Bristol, and Campbell himself is a change management specialist and award-winning author. So welcome once more, Campbell, to the programme today. Let's talk a bit about your exotic background, because you were born in Melbourne in Australia. Let's just sell Melbourne to people. Is it a nice place to visit?
Well, Melbourne's fabulous, but it's got the same sort of climate as London. So we ended up moving to Queensland, which is subtropical, which is where I ended up growing up. It's a fabulous place to visit.
You studied physics at Melbourne University, though, didn't you?
I did. I ended up going back. I accidentally joined the Air Force straight after school, and I still have the proud record of being the worst pilot ever to make it through to jets after the physics degree. So. I had to memorize the eye chart to get through. I was quite atrocious.
Well, you did fly jets for a time. I mean, you didn't crash any of those jets, did you?
No, landings were a bit sudden though. But that was as soon as I left the Air Force, when my instructor said, "Oh, thank goodness for that," when I resigned, that I embarked on a ridiculous multiple career of nothing but change, which culminated in this book.
Just a final word about the jet flying that you did do for a time. Were there times when you were in the cockpit, surrounded by myriad different components and buttons and switches and dials, and you thought, what the hell's going on?
Without a doubt. In fact, my last flight was just before my 21st birthday. And I took off over Perth, went up to 20,000 feet, all on my own. I did barrel rolls and loop-the-loops. Finally came back down, parked the jet, put the pins in the ejection seat, took off my helmet, strolled into my instructor's office. And this was 2 years before Top Gun. So I had no idea how cool this must have looked. And then I saluted him and said, "I'd like to resign, sir." And he said, "Oh, thank goodness for that." So so that was the end of my flying career.
Well, you've subsequently become an international business advisor, keynote speaker and author, and you help leaders worldwide. I mean, looking at your work over the years, you've worked not just in Australia, but the UK, Europe, Asia, Middle East, and you advise a vast range of companies, including wealth funds and BP, the BBC, American Express. Just tell me how you got into that line of work. How did you fall into it from a completely different career beforehand?
Yes, it was. I'd started my own multimedia business back in the 90s in Sydney. And then Accenture, as it's now known, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Would you like to come over and run our e-business division here in Sydney?" Because I was one of the few people back then who knew what E in business meant when it was put together. When I was at Accenture, I suddenly found that change was a discipline, not something that just happened, that you could actually influence it and manage it and lead it, and not just change in organizations, but personal change as well. So that was the start of my change journey. And then I met this gorgeous girl in a pub in Sydney, and 22 years ago, moved to the UK.
Let's just briefly mention your previous books. You wrote The Change Catalyst, Secrets to Successful and Sustainable Business Change. It was a Business Book of the Year 2018, so that went well. How would you sum up that particular publication?
Well, it is a leadership book. When I was writing it in the year of change, that's 2016, I just set about writing my experiences in helping organizations and leaders to change. And it ended up being a leadership book as I was halfway through it. I thought, goodness me, this is all about leadership. So when I finished the book, I submitted it to Wiley, and thankfully they said yes, and they published it in 2017. And I was stunned when it went on to win the inaugural Business Book of the Year in 2018. So it's for leaders of organizations, large and small, who are looking to lead change. And frankly, leadership is all about leading change these days.
You've also written The Power to Change, How to Harness Change to Make It Work for You. The issue, of course, fundamentally, Campbell, is a fear of change, which many of us have inside us.
That's so true. That is so true, and that's why I wrote the second book, which is also summarized in You Part Two. The Power to Change is all about embracing personal change. HR directors and CEOs asked me to run workshops for employees on how to embrace change, because if companies don't have leaders who can lead change and people who can embrace change, then nothing's going to happen. So it's a very personal book about anyone that helpful for anyone that is going through any sort of change, no matter what age they are.
Yeah, and of course, change is inevitable. Apparently, apart from a vending machine, famously. But you look at an organisation.
Oh, I do like that one.
You look at an organisation like, say, Marks and Spencers, which was a real big player on the British High Street for many, many years, and of course, it still is quite important. But it's had to adapt. It's had to change. It made a major change a number of years ago when it swapped from using exclusively British suppliers to sourcing stuff from around the world. And if it hadn't have changed, it wouldn't have kept its margins, and it would have gone under.
That is so true, and so many organizations simply have to change. In fact, as I talk about it all three books, is that change is something that you can't treat as a one-off or with a start date and an end date. It's just a part of life, and that's true for individuals as it is for organizations. The best organization, the organization that is best at change in the entire world, is Microsoft. When they started in the late 70s, they were a completely different beast than they are today. And they've completely pivoted their entire organization about 3 times now and have stayed as one of the top 2, 3, 4 companies in the world because of it. So it's about being brave enough to change when you're on top of your game. And that is good for organizations as well as any of us, really. Yeah,
I mean, there are many examples of companies changing. I mean, look at Wilkinson Sword, which we know have as a razor company. They don't make many swords these days, and they've adapted and yet, and continue to thrive. Let's talk about your new book then. You Part 2, Thriving in the Second Half of Your Life, written together with your wife, Jane, who we must mention because she's from Bristol. She had a corporate career, didn't she, originally, I think?
Very much so. She, when I was going through my various incarnations of an entrepreneur, she was the one with the steady senior executive role. She was head of sponsorships for Pepsi in Australia. She worked for Ogilvy and Mather. She was head of sponsorships for and donations and brand strategy for Barclays over here. So, and then 17 years ago, she decided to change. And her Part 2 started 17 years ago when she decided, I want to be a yoga teacher. So now she's the most insightful yoga teacher and yoga therapist that you'll ever have the luxury of meeting.
I have to ask you, Campbell, if you indulge in any yoga yourself.
Oh, I knew that was coming. Not as much as Jane would like me to, or as much as I should. But yes, I'm at her one of her classes every week, and I try to do more than that. And I'm certainly at every one of her international retreats.
Well, let's talk about the book then. It's been very well received. Kirsty Young, former presenter of Desert Island Discs, who's been involved in many businesses herself through her husband, says about the book, forget the cardigan and slippers and buy this instead, a clear-headed, invigorating and inspiring guide to the rest of your life. Tell me, first of all, Campbell, what drove you to write the book in the first place, to focus on that second part of our life?
Well, it came to me, the idea of the book came to me a little later than it should have, to be perfectly honest. It was my 55th birthday 3 years back, when suddenly I woke up and found that marketing directors all across the globe seemed to have put me in a little box that was marked old and irrelevant. I was getting ads for Viagra and Tenement adult nappies, or from financial services companies saying that I could now draw down some of my pensions, and it was as though I was just suddenly, oh bless, you've tried your best, and the world was patting me on the head, and I was furious. I'd only just begun at 55. I'd only just worked out what I was good at and what I was never going to be any good at, and my whole career was as a speaker and as a consultant and as a lecturer at Henley Business School had really just taken off, and it seemed the world was putting me in as pressing the pause button. And I thought, that's ridiculous. So I saw this wonderful ad in Zurich Airport of a 60-year-old man who was sailing his yacht across the ocean, and it said 60 is the new 40. And I thought, yes, That's how they should be advertising to us. And so that spurred me on to start writing the book. And why Jane got involved is that I showed her the ad that inspired me, and she said, that's atrocious. That's not aimed at women at all. 60 is the new 40, just talks about youth, and women would hate that ad. And I went, right, we need to write this book together. Well, it worked out really, really well.
You claim in the book that the middle-aged, and I class myself amongst them, are facing a dilemma. They're going through a period of multiple life-altering changes at the same time, at work, at home, and of course within, physically and also mentally. A lot of changes going on at the same time.
It is. And my favorite chapter in the book is the one that Jane and I wrote together, called Menopause versus Menopause. And just a spoiler alert, menopause wins hands down. But her writing in that chapter particularly is exceptional. And I could not have written that chapter, obviously. But we are going through so many changes. We suddenly look back on our first half and think, okay, what have we learnt? And we're living longer. How do we live well for longer? We look to the second half and say, what can I now do? And we're changing our status. We're changing the way we think of ourselves. We're changing the way that other people look at us. We're changing our relationships. In fact, one of the stats we found when we put the book together is that divorces amongst the over 50s is increasing, and 66% of those are instigated by women. So we're really changing. A lot is changing in our lives. And what Jane and I wanted to do in this book is to give a book that is optimistic and pragmatic about how we can thrive in this second half. Because it's not the end of the beginning. It's not the beginning of the end. It's just the end of the beginning. Bring it on.
Yeah, and you look at the changes that have happened in our lives. I mean, the mobile phone hadn't arrived when I was at school. Computers were scarcely anywhere, and yet the young people of today, it's like bread and butter to them. They're grown on it, and they're so used to it. The extraordinary changes in the last 50 years from a technological point of view, some people could feel overwhelmed by those.
That is so true. I can remember as a 6-year-old watching Neil Armstrong land on the moon on a grainy black and white television, and try explaining that to my 23-year-old son, and he sort of can't get his head around the fact that A, 1969 people were real, B, they had television, and what do you mean you watched him land on the moon? There's so much technology change that's gone on, but the over 50s have adopted this technology just as quickly as anybody else. I mean, sure, we need to turn to millennials if we've got a Wi-Fi problem, but there is so much more that we can bring to the equation, and that what we used to condescendingly call the silver surfers are an enormous part of the population. My 80-year-old parents do all their banking online. We Zoom them every week from Australia. Everything is done online, and it's just not a problem. So I think we can adapt to change. What we've learned the last 2 years is we can all adapt to change far better than we thought we could, and we can take that into the second half of our lives and just make it. We can flourish.
You mentioned both your parents and your children in your answer then, and you say in the book that for the middle-aged, the relationships they have with their parents, with their children, with their partners are all entering new phases.
That is true. I think we're a unique generation. I mean, you could say that every generation is, but we're the sandwich generation. Our parents are living longer and getting older, so we need to look at some point on about aged care and helping them to be well for longer in their lives. And we've got a whole section on the labyrinth that is aged care in this country, and we compare it to Australia and the US and throughout Europe as well. But we also have kids who are leaving university and then coming home to roost for quite a while. So we're sort of caught in the middle at the moment. We're helping our kids to get on their career ladder, and we're helping our parents with really the final phases of their lives. And so we're torn. And meanwhile, we're going through. More of us have been made redundant. More of us are starting our own businesses. So there's a lot going on in our generation. And what we wanted to do was write a book that wasn't just saying, woe is us, and we're getting older and we're not as physically fitted or run as fast as we used to. We want to look at the positives and which there are many, and taking our experience and really making a difference in Act Two.
Tell me a little bit how we deal with ageism. I mean, you sort of obliquely referred to that a moment ago, but there is an argument, of course, that with age comes experience, which is very valuable. Do you feel that experience isn't valued enough, though, by enough organisations?
Well, good point. We found in our research that only 16% of workers in their 50s and their 60s believe that their experience is actually valued by their employer, and that came from a detailed survey in HR magazine. And in fact, it's worse than that. A study of about 10,000 companies by, I think it was HBR and Deloitte, found that 2/3 of businesses see age as a competitive disadvantage. So we've got a lot of work to do in the world of work before employers really value older workers. And I actually give a great example in the book about Aviva, who's delivered some great workshops and for their experienced workers, who are 1/3 of their workforce, to help them to forge longer careers with the organization, and to really use their experience and thrive at work over the next 10, 15 years. Because our age, until the last 12 months, we're not retiring early. And some of those who have retired, about a quarter of those who have retired, are now unretiring. So, the workforce of the future is an aging workforce. What we need to do is to help organizations to realize the value they've got in their experienced workers.
Well, you say in the book how people can be of middle-aged, more engaged, more inspired, more equipped to thrive in the second half of their lives. And you've already mentioned about how we're living longer and we're healthier for longer. Look back 50 years when people would retire at 60, would often be dead by 70. And that, of course, has financial implications, particularly for pensions and one thing and another. The world really is changing, isn't it? I mean, the build-up of our society, the ages within it, has shifted quite fundamentally. And ironically, the world that we live in seems to be obsessed with youth at the same time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is. It's a world that's obsessed with youth, and yet it's an aging world. Almost 4 in 10 of us right around the world are 50 and over. And but I think what employers should be doing is should be pairing up experienced employees and the new Gen Z and millennials, because then they bring different ways of looking at things. But if we were to have innovation hubs in business, that's what we need to be doing. Put experienced people and new Gen Z and millennials together, because they have far better problem-solving skills than we do, but we have so much more experience than they do. And the combination, as some companies are now starting to do, the combination would be invaluable. And in fact, if we start a business ourselves, and almost half of small businesses are run by people over 50, then I think you need to grab a millennial or preferably even a Gen Z and actually and engage them in the organization to give it the extra energy and a different perspective. And I think that way any small business would just thrive.
Well, it's a cracking book that's actually ideal pitched at me, so thank you very much for that. It's called It's called You Part 2, Thriving in the Second Half of Your Life. It's written by Campbell McPherson together with his wife Jane. It's published by Robinson, and you certainly don't sound like you're slowing down, Campbell.
No, not at all. In fact, I joked with my wife the other day. It feels in about 2 years' time, when I'm 60, my business will be thriving so much that that retirement is decades away.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories and knowledge on the programme today, Campbell. Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.
There you go. That is Campbell McPherson, an expert on change management and the author of several books, including award-winning book, The Change Catalyst. His new book is called You Part 2, Thriving in the Second Half of Your Life. It's newly published by Robinson.